Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome back. We are looking at the topic, the cross question, and in this series we are looking at whether or not the Prophet Isa, peace be upon him, was actually crucified on the cross or not, according to the Christian text. We are limiting ourselves to the text that is at hand and not using external text, but only what we have in front of us. And so we've been looking at the character of Paul or Saul, or whatever you want to call him, who has come into the Christian community. We've looked at his character. When he's with the Jews, he's a Jew. When he's with the Gentiles, he's a Gentile. When he is with the Romans, he's a Roman. So he's all things to all people, as he himself says. He actually says, I am all things to all people. When I'm with the Jews, I'm a Jew. When I'm with the Gentile, I'm with the Gentile. When I'm with the Greeks, I'm with the Greek. So he says that himself. He's not embarrassed to say that. If you're a revert to Islam, and your Christian friends come up to you and you're a Christian before, you don't say, I'm a Christian. That would be the worst thing. Astaghfirullah, we ever say such a thing. We would say, I'm a Muslim. We would never dare say that. Unless, of course, your life was threatened. And then it's permissible to say, okay, I'm a Christian, just so that you don't get killed. But generally, even if that situation happened to me, I've been beaten up a good few times because I've said I'm a Muslim in Christian communities. So we don't do that. But Paul has no problem. So he starts quarrels with Jesus' disciples. He starts quarrels with Jesus' companions. When he's around the apostles, he belittles them. He runs them down to the other Christian communities that are around at that time. Paul does all these things, and he starts to promote his own teachings, the teachings of his own practices, and the practices that Jesus taught, the practices that the Prophet Isa, peace be upon him, gave, that we know to be true even from Islamic sources. He comes and does the exact opposite. He breaks those teachings down. He brings his own teachings and his own practices. After all, it was Paul who claimed, I have been entrusted with the gospel for the Gentiles. So he says, he comes with a whole new teaching. He says, I have been entrusted with the gospel to the Gentiles, as surely as Peter has been entrusted with the gospel for the Jews. So to appease some of the people that were still a bit skeptical about him, he says, I have been entrusted with the gospel for the Gentiles. I'm going forward. Because they were having success amongst the Gentiles. It's like one of those name it, claim it, and frame it churches. Those name it, claim it, and frame it? Those churches, the Pentecostal churches that go crazy, they do the same thing. Like, they only go where the money is. They're not going to go to the poor communities where they've got no money, the communities that hardly have anything to offer. They go to the big rich cities, and they put their tent campaigns there because they know that people are going to give 10%. They're going to make a lot of money that day. So Paul is the same type of guy. He goes off and he's looking for the rich lands. He's going for the money. He's going where he's going to win people over. Where Peter was having problems. He hardly made any disciples or hardly made anybody Christian. So for God, those who want to obey him, those who want to keep his commandments that God had sent, like Peter and all the rest of the disciples, Paul says he's not interested. He is going to be an apostle. He's going to be an apostle to the Gentiles, and Paul can remain apostle to the rest. And this we can read about, by the way, I'm not making this up. This is found in Galatians chapter 2, verse 7 to 9. Galatians chapter 2, verse 7 to 9. You can read the whole story where he actually says that I have been entrusted with the gospel to the Gentiles, and Peter has been entrusted with the gospel to the Jews. And so we find him going against the very teachings of what the Prophet Isa, peace be upon him, had given. So Paul is not known to have met many of the apostles or those followers, early followers of Jesus Christ during his journeys. So we don't find anywhere where he's having lunch with any of the disciples or spending time with them or anything like that. We only have the one account where he's introduced by Barnabas, but we don't find Paul to have even met or come in contact with him. But clever old shrewd Paul, he has the ability to work upon these simpleton disciples of Jesus as the Gospels project them. This is not my words. This is the way the Gospel presents them. The Gospel always presents the apostles as being simpletons, not very smart. Like, we see Paul somehow being able to, he's all sophisticated and educated and learned, being able to influence power over them. Because, as the Gospels say, they were not very smart. They were simpletons, in fact, the way it is. We'll get into that later. So it's not me saying that in a derogatory term. It's a term that's actually used in the Gospels itself, as we'll see later. The disciples themselves stuck to the original teachings of Jesus, peace be upon him, as he taught it in the Gospels, only to take the message to the Jews, and they were supposed to do. And this is what they wanted to do. They wanted to keep to the original. They didn't want to do any innovation. Christianity is a case study of why we as Muslims believe that bid'ah is wrong, that innovation is wrong. By adding anything to the religion of Islam is wrong. All you have to do is look at Christianity. If you look at Christianity, the way it was going before Paul came along, it was on the right path. Everything was going perfectly well. The minute Paul comes along, he brings innovation and he destroys it. Now people might be saying, but look how successful Christianity is. It didn't destroy it. Paul and his innovation actually helped it. It helped it grow, but not as a religion. It helped it grow as a pagan cult. Christmas trees, Easter bunnies, Halloween, all these things have crept their way into the church because Paul left 100,000 doors open for all this to creep in. If it had the original message before Paul came along of Christianity, there would be no such thing as Christmas, Christmas trees, Easter bunnies, Halloween. None of that would have ever been accepted because none of those doors would have been open for innovation to come along. So we said it was the only stepping stone that Paul had was to make sure that he could belittle, knock down, destroy the teachings of the early Christian church and those disciples and those that were around during the time so that he could bring in his own gospel. So we find in Galatians, in chapter 2, verse 12 to 13, it says, "But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face. Even Barnabas was carried away and played falsely just like the rest." So what he's trying to say is that when the disciples came, when the apostles came, when any of the original 12 of the prophet Isa, peace be upon him, came, they were false. They were not following the real gospel. They were not following the real teachings. But I, Paul, who am only a new convert, know so much better. All those people are actually liars, and I oppose them to their face. This is what he says. He shows off when he says it. He says, I oppose them to their face. Even Barnabas was carried away and played into their false likes, just like the rest did. And so this is the way that Paul speaks about them. Like he is this great superior man. I mean, when you revert to Islam, even if you've been a Muslim for 20 years or 30 years or 40 years, even if you're a born Muslim, we respect those people with more knowledge. Yet he comes and he destroys them and tries to knock them down. So you read it for yourself. Galatians chapter 2, verse 12 and 13, you'll find this. And then what we find is that he doesn't even stop there. He turns this into an open challenge. It erupts into an open challenge where he starts attacking the character of the disciples. He starts attacking the character of the early church. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 18, he goes on and he says, so many people brag about their earthly distinctions that I shall do so also. So he says, these disciples, they might brag about their distinctions being, not that they got PhDs or whatever, their distinctions were, we are disciples because we are the first generation. We walked and talked and ate with Jesus ourselves. This is what he's referring to. Now, Paul says, just because they were around the first generation, because they ate and sat and spoke and drank with the prophet Isa, peace be upon him, that doesn't mean anything. I can also brag. What could he possibly brag about? Oh, well, he saw Jesus himself on a vision. He fell off his donkey, and then he had a vision. But anyway, whatever the story is, in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 18, we see him say that. In 2 Corinthians 11, verse 23, just a few verses later, it says, I can outdo them all. He's bragging. He says, if this disciple says he can do that, I can do more. He says, I can outdo them all. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 11, a little bit earlier, it says, in no respect did I fall short of those apostles, that he was better to those apostles. How could he be? Would we say as Muslims, we would never, astaghfirullah, that we'd ever even think of this, but we would never say that we're better than the first generation of Muslims, or the second generation of Muslims, or the third generation of Muslims that were around during the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, or directly after him. We would never say that. It doesn't matter how great a scholar you are right now on planet Earth, we would never say it. We don't have the arrogance to say it. Yet he has absolutely no problem with saying it 4 times in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. 4 times he has an attack at the disciples. 4 times he attacks their character. These pillars, as they are called, he himself calls them the pillars of society. But then later he attacks them and belittles them like this. So finally, he breaks away from even his mentor and companion, Barnabas. Paul breaks away from him, and he doesn't even have anything more to do with Barnabas. Eventually, maybe it's the way I just said that, it maybe gives you the wrong idea. I said that he broke away even from Barnabas. Perhaps it was another way around. Perhaps they all broke away from him and realized, this man is going to take us into shirk. This man is going to take us into bid'ah. And so they broke from him, and they moved away from him and realized that if they spent another second around him, they would be defiled, and they would be corrupting the original message that the Prophet Isa, peace be upon him, had. And so to preserve themselves, they thought it was better just to leave. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Next week, we'll continue, inshallah. So from me, Areeb, Islam, until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.